save for a rainy day. Foreign investment was meant to resume, but cash actually flowed out. And the property market was supposed to stabilize, but instead sank deeper into crisis. Such factors led to an uneven post-health crisis economic recovery, even if the economy is on track to hit its growth target for the year of about 5%. Reuters Deputy Hong Kong Bureau Chief Marius Zaharia says that all raised some big questions.
Voices that compare China today with Japan in the 1990s have grown louder this year. The core of the problem, its economic model, which has done miracles for many decades since it was adopted in the 1980s. But according to some economists, it stopped working so well about a decade ago when it began producing more debt than growth.
Japan has long since accepted it will never return to the roaring growth rates it once knew. With its population now shrinking and aging, some economists think that's China's fate too. Beijing officials are having none of it.
The fundamentals of China's long-term economic growth have not changed and will not change.
Policymakers have vowed to shift the economy away from its reliance on property. This year they pledged to boost consumption by households instead. But analysts say there is still no clear roadmap for change. Mounting tensions with the US don't help either, as President Xi Jinping acknowledged in November.
Whether China and the United States are ultimately rivals or partners is a fundamental and overarching question.
Any change could stoke resentment. Youth unemployment has already soared, and many Chinese have seen their wages cut. Falling property prices are making homeowners feel poor, and tackling the vast debts built up by real estate firms and local governments will mean asking who pays the bill. Households, firms, banks, someone else? It's not clear. Marius Zaharia again.
But reform is always difficult anywhere, but also in China, because it runs into considerations of social stability, and it runs into very tough decisions to be made as to which institutions or which sectors of the economy will bear the cost for these policies.
For now, government advisors are still talking about targeting 5% growth again next year. Looking across the sea to Japan, some economists think that might be hard to sustain.
Investors, economists, business leaders, and consumers all share a common hope for 2024: rate cuts. Some economies like the UK and Eurozone could have to wait until later in the year due to stubborn inflation and strong wage growth. But others, like the US, may see them as early as the spring. Here's Reuters Economics and Financial Markets editor for the Americas, Dan Burns.
Well, some borrowing costs for consumers and businesses have already started dropping just in the expectation that policymakers at central banks will cut their interest rates in 2024. Now, will they keep dropping at that rate? That's unlikely, but it's a pretty strong expectation that home loan costs, credit card costs, business loan costs are going to be lower in 2024 than they are right now.
After starting 2023 with annual inflation rates that were on average 3.7 times the 2% target shared by most developed economies' central banks, the pace of price increases is now down to 1.5 times that target.
Now, if at some point inflation stops improving, that's going to make central bankers edgy and less willing to bring down borrowing costs. But if the kind of progress that we've seen on inflation in the last few months holds course, that will give confidence to central bankers to begin lowering borrowing costs in the first half of the year.
But a major game of chicken is underway as market actors have set expectations for far more easing than central bankers may be willing to provide.
The Federal Reserve, for one, recently forecast 75 basis points or 0.75 of a percentage point in interest rate reductions over the course of 2024. financial markets, the bond market, interest rate futures markets, are now pricing expectations for 150 basis points, essentially twice what the Fed itself is forecasting. At some point, one of these parties has to be right. Potentially, they meet somewhere in the middle, but somebody right now is going to be disappointed. And if recent history is any guide, it may be markets are a little bit overextended in their optimism for how far rates are going to drop next year.
But the key to it all rests with inflation. As policymakers have said, they're willing to stomach some level of economic pain to finally return price pressures to their target levels.